All right. I thought tomorrow was going to be fun, but today is going to be more fun. Quick recap of where we are. So last time we spent quite a lot of time talking about the, let's say, the elements of the scientific picture of the world, but beyond that, and elements, just hints of what some of these amazing models that have emerged from this burst of model creation over the last few centuries, these scientific theories that explain the world around us in progressively finer detail, that has produced such an amazing picture of the physical world around us. I gave a glimpse of some elements of these theories, but what I really wanted to emphasize in that were a couple of meta points. First of all, that all of these theories in the end are evaluated by their results in the world. Do they work? There's no question of, does it correspond to reality? Nobody knows what capital R reality is. We build models. Do the models work? If they work, then, we assume that it must at least be correlated with reality in some way, because it shouldn't at least go in the opposite direction. But this whole question of certainty, this whole question of, I have a theory which is 100% the correct theory, which implies that all other theories must be wrong, is sort of far behind us in the rearview mirror as we embark upon this scientific project of modeling the world. And so part of this project is iterating on our models, learning from our mistakes, embracing uncertainty as a part of the process. Maybe you can guess where I'm going to go with this. I want to apply these same insights to the spiritual domain. And it's into the spiritual domain that I want to begin to journey today. So if yesterday we talked about, and we really ended on this point, that however amazingly accurate our scientific theories are at predicting phenomena, especially at the micro level, you can set up an experiment, a particle collider or something like that, and you can compute results that are accurate and precise to 10, 12 significant digits. But if you were to ask, do these processes explain, if you were to ask, what do these processes explain on the sort of largest scales? The answer you get is, things are running down in the end. The answer you get is, the only thing we can be sure of on the largest scales is entropy, is that heat is going to be flowing from the hot spots to the cold spots, and that eventually everything is going to reach the same temperature, and that's when basically the universe dies. No life can be sustained at that part. And the problem, of course, is that we look around us and we see life everywhere. We're surrounded by life, purpose, things growing, things moving opposite to the direction of running down, opposite to the direction of increasing disorder. And it's very natural to ask, is something missing from our scientific theories if they can explain disorder, but they can't explain order? So in a way, this whole presentation today will be an attempt at filling in that gap. Because the best that the scientific picture of the world can do is say, and by way of explaining life and meaning and everything that surrounds us, which is not trending towards disorder, the best that science can do is say, We are in a very special location. We're on the surface of a planet which happens to be near a star that is pumping out huge amounts of low entropy energy over a large amount of time, and it's pouring onto the surface of a planet that has a lot of matter on it, and it has a large amount of water on it, and this has been going on for billions of years, and so you can roll the dice enough times in these, in this very exceptional environment to eventually get life. In other words, it's kind of, you invoke a black box and you say, well, it's plausible that life can emerge because you're rolling the dice so many times, because it's such a big space in which it might possibly happen. And here's where I think, if we're honest, we come to a fork in the road. The fork in the road, in a way. And we have to choose. On the one hand, we can say, this explanation is enough for me. We can say, it paints a plausible enough picture of how we got here. And if this picture supplies no intrinsic meaning to life, if it doesn't give us any sense of where things are going, if in the end it is just atoms in the void, if this picture does lead us to Alan Watts's metaphor that we're all just tubes in the end, taking in food at one end and letting it out at the other, and making noises at one end, then we can at least make that journey better by creating our own meanings and goals out of nothing, just kind of bootstrapping our own meaning. And this is an honest, if bleak, to me, choice. And I think it also should be acknowledged that it represents its own leap of faith. A leap of faith that the universe is big enough, and there's enough time that's passed, and there's enough energy flows and so forth, that life can somehow emerge entirely by accident within it. We're sort of trusting without really understanding. We're trusting that that this totally accidental picture is the true and accurate one. On the other hand, again, this is the big fork in the road. On the other hand, we can choose meaning. We can say, this is not enough. Something important is missing from this picture. As accurate and beautiful as it is, as much as it has revealed to us such incredible deep structures of reality, the symmetries and the precision of it, we can still say something important is missing. And we can say, well, to get to the piece that's missing, we could say, well, let's add it in, let's stitch it in as a kind of intervention, that something outside this system is adding meaning to it. We could say that the universe is the way it is because, and life emerges in it because it's been fine-tuned to appear that way. Or we could say some intelligent designer has designed it that way. In other words, we can find some way of inserting what has been called the God of the gaps into it in order to get the meaning which we feel has to be there. I will be proposing that we don't have to go that way either. We can get our meaning in a bottom-up way rather than a top-down way. And I'll explain hopefully what I mean by that as we move along. So this nagging feeling that we have in looking at this totally physical picture of the world We can ask ourselves, is this just the echo of old superstitions? Is this biases that I haven't yet cleared out of my mind? This intuition I have that life is not just a vastly improbable accident, but the very point of it all is the choice that we have to make. Because when we look at the world, we can choose to look at the world as though everything is alive, not that everything is in the process of dying, everything is in the process of ultimately running down. We can look at the world in the sense that everything is alive or wants to become alive and conscious. We can look at the world as though the universe were in a constant state of waking up, not everywhere, all at once, in the same way, but waking up at different rates, in different places. So it seems to be quite dead in a lot of places. In other places it's boiling with life, teeming with life, and pregnant with meaning. It seems to be programmed, as it were, to strive to transcend itself. And it does this not by continuing its atomized existence individually, but by coming together in larger and larger coherent groupings, aggregations, as though something is emerging from the greater association. The coming together of things seems to be, as we look at cosmic history through the past 13 or 14 billion years, if we can identify a thread that runs through it, it's that matter, of course, is coming alive. How is it coming alive? By things coming together in new ways, in new kinds of configurations. What is it that causes two things to come together? It's an attractive force. Abdu'l-Baha, in one of his well-known tablets, says, this force is love. So we can look at the coming together of things throughout cosmic history as the force of love unfolding itself throughout time. A force of love, whether it is operating in the mineral degree by atoms joining together in the hearts of stars to release the light that permeates the universe, or whether that love is between individual beings, conscious beings on a planet like ours. It's all different versions of love. And this love brings things together and interconnects everything together. Abdu'l-Baha, in many places, talks about this interconnectedness of all things, this organic nature of a world that is growing and progressing, not just within an individual lifetime as we physically grow, but cosmically as an entire, say, ecosystem of a planet grows. Quoting Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha says in one of his tablets, the Blessed Beauty saith, ye are all the fruits of one tree, the leaves of one branch. Thus hath he likened this world of being to a single tree, and all its peoples to the leaves thereof, and the blossoms and fruits. It is needful for the bough to blossom, and leaf and fruit to flourish. And upon the interconnection of all parts of the world tree dependeth the flourishing of leaf and blossom, and the sweetness of the fruit. And elsewhere on this topic of interconnectedness, he says, all beings are linked together like a chain, and mutual aid, assistance, and interaction are among their intrinsic properties and are the cause of their formation, development, and growth. It is established through numerous proofs and arguments that every single thing has an effect and influence upon every other, either independently or through a causal chain. Interesting, he said this in right around 1906, and it wasn't until quite a number of decades later that this was actually shown to be quite literally true in the quantum entanglement of things. It's possible for atoms on opposite sides of the universe, nevertheless, to be intimately connected. through the laws of quantum mechanics. So this intuition of interconnectedness, which Abdu'l-Baha is stating here, but which is a very ancient idea, is another one of the ideas that has emerged from the modern scientific picture. We can think then of this interconnectedness as being well, Abdu'l-Baha tells us something about this interconnectedness, and we may not expect, or we may be surprised at what he derives from it, because you might say, well, this interconnectedness is all about the laws of nature, it's all about the physical world. Abdu'l-Baha says this actually defines religion for us. And this is a radical redefinition of religion. He says religion then is the necessary connection which emanates from the realities of things. And let's just pause for a moment to think of how revolutionary an idea this is. How 180 degrees opposite the way we might have thought about religion before. Something that was sent down, something that was almost as though by magic, almost as though a bolt of lightning strikes and something's now in the world that was not in the world before. Top down. Abdu'l-Baha here proposes a definition of religion which is bottom up. But the interesting thing, as we'll see, is that he doesn't say, well, the top-down picture is wrong. He says it's complementary to the bottom-up picture. He's never exclusionary in the way he introduces these things. And it's the same thing with science. It's possible that you can have different theories that even map a given terrain, and one theory may map it at some level of resolution, and the other may map it at another level of resolution. You may have Newton's laws that explain gravity to a certain degree, and actually they might be better and simpler to use in most instances. But that same phenomenon can be explained using the much more complicated laws of general relativity. So you can have two different theories that explain the same set of phenomena. And maybe one's easier to use, but maybe the other one is a little bit more comprehensive. Maybe it's the same way with these top-down, bottom-up ideas that we find, both of which very much pervasive in the Baha'i writings. And if you were to quantify them, you would probably say, well, most of the Baha'i writings are in this top-down mode. They talk about God as most other religions do, as the creator, as the bestower, as the forgiver, the judger, the one with whom we have a personal relationship, the one to whom we pray, the one who answers our prayers or doesn't answer our prayers. This idea of God, this top-down idea of God, the idea of God as a being whose existence is potentially provable through rational arguments, is one way, and only one way, of conceptualizing the divine, a way that has sustained individuals and civilizations, perhaps for a very long time, but has never been the only way of conceptualizing these deepest questions. And this definition of religion as identical with the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things opens a door into a complementary way of understanding these deepest questions. A way in which the divine is not out there somewhere perhaps, but within all things. But it's interesting that Abdu'l-Baha doesn't stop there with religion and interconnectedness. He also says, perhaps more predictably, in one of his later tablets written to Dr. Farrell, that by nature is meant those inherent properties and necessary relations derived from the realities of things. So nature, predictably, is basically the sum total of physical laws, these necessary relationships. But it's interesting, and I think no accident, that religion and nature receive identical definitions by Abdu'l-Baha. But how odd that is, because in the past, nature was seen as that thing which maybe moves along according to its own laws and principles, until God has a different idea and raises the dead, or turns water into wine, or performs some miracle, or answers a prayer, or sends a prophet, reveals a holy book, which we think of as being some interruption in the normal course of nature. But if nature and religion are defined identically, then we have to think about this in different terms. And I think Baha'u'llah also, in his Tablet of Wisdom, points us in this same direction when he says nature is an expression of the will of God, the primal will acting in and through the contingent world. That is what the theologians, what the religious people of the past have said. This is God's action in the world, Abdu'l Baha says, is what the natural scientists have always said, well, this is nature. All along it's been, people have been arguing over nothing. They've been arguing over a non-existent distinction. But to realize that that distinction is non-existent is to ignite a revolution in religious thought, because it opens this doorway to this bottom-up way of thinking. And going on, it's not just religion and nature that receive this treatment, but love. Also, we think, well, love is this conscious decision by one human being, but it's far more than that. You know, it is that, but it's more than that. Love also, as Abdu'l Baha says, it's the cause of God's revelation unto man, the vital bond inherent in accordance with the divine creation in the realities of things. And if the English words are a little bit different, if you go to the Persian underneath, the Persian words are nearly identical between these three descriptions of religion, nature, and love. So, going back to this complementary picture we had yesterday, this picture of what we could call a descending arc, an arc of the physical universe, which begins with some as yet poorly understood moment in time, which was somewhat flippantly called the Big Bang, but the name has stuck, and now everyone uses that phrase, which is a terrible phrase because, you know, something that bangs or explodes like a stick of dynamite, you know, it's exploding into an existing space. And that's already quite far from what the Big Bang Theory is about. There wasn't an existing space and time, and then the universe explodes into it. But space and time somehow emerge with matter and energy in a way that is yet quite poorly understood, although the process of it and the effects of it can be traced backwards quite far back in time. But what I'm proposing is that complementary to this physical picture of the universe emerging in an instant of an instant cataclysmic eruption of matter and energy and space and time coming into being that has been progressing for many billions of years, giving rise to stars, planets, life, consciousness, and so forth. That actually the life in consciousness bit can be seen as in a way, the other half of the story. You know, the piece of the story that's not explained by the physical processes themselves. Cannot be seen when you investigate the movement of interaction of atoms in a laboratory. Like entropy itself, which can only be seen when you see matter acting at large scales over a period of time, this emergence of life is something which also can only be seen in the interaction of matter over a long period of time. It's invisible at the micro level. You can't design an experiment in a laboratory saying, see, here's where spirit enters. You know, if it emerges in the same way that entropy is an emergent phenomenon, then it would be, or it could be, invisible to our most detailed scientific explanation. I don't want to suggest, however, that that's how it has to be. It's perhaps possible that science has not yet discovered that principle that tends towards the upbuilding of matter. There's no reason why we should be afraid, actually, of scientists at some point identifying a principle in the universe that tends to work against entropy. That wouldn't be a defeat. of religion or a spiritual point of view, that would actually be, I think, a huge victory. It would solidify this intuition that we have that the universe is comprised of these complementary processes of integration and disintegration. This intuition that we have that life is, or that the universe is this dance between life and death. And it just happens to be that we kind of figured out the death part before we figured out the life part. So, so this thread of a process that traces itself through the evolution of the physical world is what I want to trace, this thread of love, upbuilding matter and generating consciousness, of generating organisms that begin very simple, unicellular, and then end up being very complex. If we want, we can call this the emergence of consciousness. If we want, because they're different, this is just a word, what does it attach to? If we want, we can call it spirit. Unfortunately, the word spirit has all sorts of connotations to different people, and so when you say that word, different people have a different thing in mind. But Abdu'l-Baha uses the word so much that we can't, I don't think we can ignore it. It's just that we have to try to perhaps be a little bit more precise in how we think about it. And in particular, how we think about it in this picture is not so much as Descartes thought about it, as an invisible substance, quite parallel to the visible material substances of the physical world that have their own causal laws, that in their own mysterious way interact with the physical matter of this world. That's the Cartesian picture, the dualistic picture of matter and of mind and matter inhabiting these separate, parallel but somehow connected realms. This is not the picture I'm proposing. The picture I'm proposing is rather that spirit is an emergent phenomenon, not that it is a separately identifiable fifth force or separate substance with its own, say, mass energy equivalent or something like that. But saying it's an emergent phenomenon does not make it any less real. I mean, entropy is also an emergent phenomenon, and a lot of physicists would say that's the most real law there is. That's the most firmly established certainty in the universe. It doesn't matter whether it is an emergent phenomenon or something that is visible and measurable in some micro process. This idea that spirit emerges throughout the universe from simple things to complex things, that's present even in the rocks. Abdu'l-Baha tells us the mineral kingdom has its own spirit. What is the spirit? Well, it's the spirit of the attraction that binds together the elements in that rock, which is love. It's just one more expression of this principle of love. And it resembles, I should mention this resembles an idea which is currently circulating today, an old idea, but which has currently become sort of more fashionable in some philosophical circles. It resembles something called panpsychism. Everything is conscious in its own way. Every atom has its own consciousness, which of course is only analogous to human consciousness. But that everything then, it's one way of trying to explain how do you get consciousness. At what moment does it arrive on the scene when matter comes together? And in the panpsychist view, there is no moment on the scene when consciousness suddenly zaps into existence. It was always there. And it may not have manifested all of its potentialities at an early time, but it was there from the very beginning. So then what we have emerging, what I'm trying to build up through kind of scattered, pulling together scattered threads, is a meta-narrative of consciousness, of spirit, of outworking love, which is the complementary force to entropy, which leads to order, which leads to greater physically things coming together in more complex configurations. History then is not just a series of random events. This happens and then that happens. Things rise and fall in no particular order. But history tells a story. The history, of course, of the universe, the history of the planet. And we could say that the story it's telling is that it's waking up and becoming aware of itself. And this is where the idea of, I want to sort of bring this idea of an arc of descent of the spiritual world and an arc of ascent, an arc of descent of the material world and the arc of ascent of the spiritual world together into a kind of picture of a circle of existence, which represents, in a word, self-knowledge, or in another word, self-love. We say, using theological language, God loved to be known. Therefore, he brought creation into being so that he might become known, which on so many levels is anthropomorphizing, of course. You say he for God, and you say he wants and loves this thing as though he's a person. So, we acknowledge at the outset that this is a model. Maybe it's helpful. But it may be helpful in the sense that it gives a sense of what's going on at the highest sort of cosmic level. And at the highest cosmic level, the universe is waking up to its own reality. And its own reality is divine, because its own reality is God's own remembrance of himself. This is how actually the Bob talks about it. And we'll go into that a little bit more, hopefully later today and also tomorrow. Just to add, I guess, so much of what I'm saying here is inspired by just a few statements in the Baha'i writings. And one of these, to me, absolutely core statements, the kind of foundational building block of this picture, comes from Paris Talks, where Abdu'l-Baha very simply says, in the realm of spirit, there's no retreat possible. All movement is bound to be towards a perfect state. Progress is the expression of spirit in the world of matter. If you think progress is just some outworking of material forces, Abdu'l-Baha says, no, this is spirit acting in the realm of matter. And I think of this as being very foundational, because this is one of those places where two sort of separate worlds in our minds are brought together in a very simple way and shown to be aspects of each other. And this idea of consciousness, why am I talking about consciousness so much? This also comes from a statement by the House of Justice not that many years ago. And this is also for me very just totally foundational in how I'm building up this picture. In One Common Faith, it says, Baha'u'llah has not brought into existence a new religion to stand beside the present multiplicity of sectarian organizations. Rather has he recast the whole conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. Another kind of explosion of redefinition. And this development of consciousness is universal. I mean, it's happening here on this planet in this particular way at this particular historical moment, but consciousness is developing all around the universe. We're just not yet aware of all the ways in which it is. I think the human race is about to take a potentially a massive leap forward in, if we're lucky, in understanding this. In just a few days, the first images from the James Webb Space Telescope will be released to the public. I was really hoping it would happen during this lecture so I could show you the images, but it's happening in like 3 days from now. And this is by far the most powerful telescope that the human race has ever built. It's looking farther out into the universe, but also with much greater precision and resolution. And one of the things it's going to be doing for the first time is analyzing the atmospheres of exoplanets, planets that are beyond our own solar system. And we know of the existence This is a little bit of interesting side detour. Too interesting not to say. But it wasn't that many years ago where it wasn't clear if planets were super rare in the cosmos or whether they were very common. There were different theories. There were different, scientists didn't have a consensus on this. It had to be determined by observation. As Baha'is, we might say, well, Baha'u'llah said every fixed star hath its planets and every planet hath its creatures, which seems to be a spectacular prediction. The first half of that prediction has now come true. It's pretty much the case that if you pick a star, it's going to have a planet, or more than one planet. They are more common than not. The second half is the interesting part, and every planet hath its creatures. Well, by creatures, what you could generously say a creature is anything. Rocks are creatures because they have a mineral spirit, right? They have a consciousness at their own level. But maybe, and obviously when we look at planets in our own solar system, like Mercury and Venus and presently Mars, it seems like they're lifeless. So they currently at least don't possess creatures as far as we've detected or can tell. But the interesting possibility, I think, arises if one wants to have some tangible prediction out of all of this. I think it would be not just that civilization is eventually going to end up in a better place than it is now. That's a tangible prediction of this, because progress is the expression of spirit in the realm of matter, and it's kind of baked in. It doesn't guarantee our civilization is necessarily going to succeed, I don't think. But what it does seem to predict, this spiritual view of progress, it seems to predict that life ought to be abundant in the universe. It ought to be. Because if the universe is here for the sake of life, if things want to become alive, if consciousness is in some way the arrowhead of physical processes, as yet undiscovered by science, perhaps forever unanalyzed by science, but if the universe wants to become alive, then there ought to be life out there on those planets where it could emerge. And what we're about to witness over the next few years are the first tentative steps at analyzing the atmospheres of other planets orbiting other stars, and with enough precision to be able to determine what is the atmospheric composition of those planets. And we know something from the atmospheres of the planets on our solar system, that the life on this planet over billions of years has drastically altered our atmosphere. The components of gases in our atmosphere are a pretty good signature of life. The free oxygen, all planets can have carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, and so forth, but it's more the proportion of these elements that is a major signature of life. And it may be in our lifetimes that we start observing planets in nearby planetary systems that just might contain the signature of life. I'm interested, I really hope I live long enough to see that happen for the first time. And I hope it's more abundant than not, because that would tend to confirm this picture. Of course, if life remains rare, that doesn't even necessarily mean that this picture is incorrect, because even on this planet, life is not equally distributed. There are lifeless regions of this planet, the great deserts and the poles and so forth. Not necessarily technically lifeless, because bacteria and small microorganisms are everywhere, but there are relatively lifeless parts of this planet as well. And when you say, well, where is the human life located? It's really concentrated in cities, in a few places, and then relatively thinly spread around other areas. So anyways, sorry for that excursion, but we're at the cusp of I think, possibly very exciting discoveries. So coming back to consciousness and this second arc. And I have to quote Carl Sagan at some point, being such a personal inspiration to me, as he states in the opening words of Cosmos. And I still remember when I was 7 years old listening to the Cosmos when he said this. It was like mind blown. We are away from Cosmos to know itself. And the capital C Cosmos, of course, is God, God's eternal active emanation that brings creation into being. Because the picture that we have emerging from this, and this is kind of a neat little historical side note, this comes from one of our earliest pilgrim notes from one of the first pilgrim groups that visited Abdu'l-Baha, and this, I believe, comes from around 1899. So this is Lua and Edward Getzinger and Curtis Kelsey were in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha, and it describes to them this vision of the universe comprised of arcs of ascent and descent. And the descending arc here is on the left and the ascending arc on the right, and you can see all these kingdoms on the left, the mineral, the animal, the vegetable, the human, and then all these spiritual degrees rising along the arc of ascent. And with God at the top, sort of emanating it all, like the sun shining its rays. And then it's nicely filled in the middle with all these attributes of God. But the main picture is this circle of existence, which is not unique at all to the Baha'i faith. We find this imagery of a circle comprised of two different arcs, all throughout different cultures and different unexpected contexts. This is actually an image from one of the earliest, it's an ancient Greek manuscript, which is one of the earliest alchemical texts that have passed down to us from history. And the insignia, the words in the middle roughly say something like, all is one. And it's this Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its tail, which different cultures have all sort of come up with. Very somehow similarly, the idea of a circle. This one is actually comprised of a dark half and a light half. It strikes me as being potentially one of the many sort of echoes of this concept that has been reinvented from time to time. And keeping the arc in motion, the thing that makes it not static but dynamic is that it is a constantly moving outpouring of love. Love for and love to. Abdu'l-Baha in Paris Talk says there's 4 kinds of love. He says there's love from the, and I wonder if I'm quoting, I don't think I quoted here, so I have to paraphrase. He says there's love from the creator to the creatures. There's the love from the creatures to the creator. And then there's the love for the creatures for each other. And then the strangest one is there's the love of the creator for its own essence. And Abdu'l-Baha in Paris Talk says, from one ray of that love, all the other love comes into being. So it's this mystical, unavoidably anthropomorphic statement of God loving his own essence that is the originating statement of what you might call a Baha'i cosmology of a circle of existence. God's love for his own essence is the essence of this circle of existence, and it's the motive force of love which lies behind it. Baha'u'llah affirms this in a tablet, which strangely has sort of dropped off the radar for Baha'is, and it was, I found it in an old journal of the Baha'i Association of Burma from the 1918 or something like that, and it was translated by Shoghi Effendi. I feel like this should be like a headline quotation, like one of those top 10 things that, like, you're the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Know thou that in every age and cycle, all laws and ordinances have been changed according to the requirements of the times, except the law of love, which like a fountain ever flows and whose course never suffers change. We wondered, because we've always heard as Baha'is that there's 2 parts to every religion. There's the unchanging part and the changing part. Well, what is the unchanging part? Baha'u'llah tells us there's only one thing that actually is the unchanging piece, and that is the law of love. Everything else changes. That's kind of an earthquake in itself, because it opens us up to levels of ambiguity we might not have been comfortable with before. It opens us up to the possibility of evolution in ways we might not thought were possible. If really the only constant in this process is the law of love. So I'm missing, I had this great quotation on the arcs of ascent and descent. Oh, so you're going to have to find that in the seminars that follow. One of the topics is the circle of existence. And I've pulled together pretty much all the quotations I can find from disparate sources on this circle of existence and arcs of ascent and descent. So you'll have a chance to read for yourself the source text on this, sort of the ground truth, so to speak, that forms the heart of this idea as I'm trying to introduce it in a Baha'i context. Now, what's the and this circle of existence, I should say, also can be thought of as just an elaboration of a Neoplatonic idea, going back traditionally attributed to Plotinus, who was a commentator on Plato in the late Roman Empire. He wrote a series of books called the Aeneids, which one of the main themes of is that the world, the universe, is a result of the emanation of the One. The One was the Greek version of what Christians would call God. And it's important that it's an emanation because just like the emanation of rays of light from the sun, it's this overflowing, bountiful process. And the idea of Plotinus is that this One is completely not jealous of what it has, but it just shares it with abandon with the world. It's just pouring out its being, not its being, but it's pouring its light out into the world. And the world then can be seen as in the station of an emanation of this light. And as we'll see, one of the quotation units that you'll also be seeing in the seminar is on emanation and the centrality of this idea, and its distinction from manifestation. And you'll be asking in your groups, what's the difference between emanation and manifestation? Why is it important to make that distinction? But why is the circle of existence useful and powerful? One of the ways, I believe, is that it embodies and makes clear to us how we can see certain truths as relative. Because conceptually, all of humanity resides on a certain point along this circle of existence. Abdu'l-Baha puts it at the opposite end from God. If he was talking to plants, he probably would put the plants at the opposite end. It's all relative. But here we are, at a certain point in this circle of existence, which defines for us what's behind us and what's in front of us. We've journeyed a certain distance, so to speak, along the kingdoms of existence, and here we are in the human kingdom. And as we look backwards into the kingdoms behind us, the animal, the vegetable, the mineral, we see what we call the material world. And as we look in front of us, to the invisible degrees, they're invisible to us because we haven't attained them yet. As we look in front of us to the journey that still lies ahead, returning to the source, we call that the spiritual world. So matter and material and spiritual then become functions of where we are on the circle of existence. They become relative to our standpoint. And this is a very neat way of understanding the distinction between material and spiritual, which is preserved in its own way, but it no longer has that kind of Cartesian substance dualism attached to it. It's no longer two kinds of stuff, but it's rather two different perspectives along life's journey. Abdu'l-Baha puts it, affirms this when he talks about what you would say about spirit if you were the vegetable. He says, The deniers ask in their disbelief, where is that world, the spiritual world? For that which has no actual material existence is sheer imagination. But the truth is that the world of existence is a single world, although its stations are manifold in accordance with the manifold realities of things. For instance, the world of mineral, plant, and animal existence is the same world. Despite this, the animal world, in relation to the world of the vegetable, is a spiritual reality and another world and abode. So, if you're the vegetable, spirit to you is the animal world. That represents the next leap forward for you along the arc of ascent. So here we have very explicitly the relativization of matter and spirit to a perspective and not two different kinds of substances. Again, it's no less real to say, it's no less useful to talk about. We can still go back into the world and talk about material and spiritual realities. It's just in our heads we're now thinking about them in different terms. And perhaps that has practical and pragmatic consequences. Because we understand that other people may be somewhere else along this arc. Other people may be at some other station along the arcs of ascent. Infinite degrees of consciousness as one ascends the arc of ascent. But just as when you're the vegetable, how you even conceptualize the world in terms of what's the spirit and what's material is completely different than when you're in the human kingdom. Likewise, as you're ascending these spiritual degrees, people might see the world very differently. They might divide things up very differently. And how are we to approach those deep divisions? Are we going to say, well, my way is right and your way is wrong? Or are we going to find ways of saying, well, from your vantage point, I can see where you're coming from. And from my vantage point, this is the way I see it, and then find a way to come together. This is like a cosmological picture that almost forces you to think in those very expansive terms, to be comfortable with the ambiguities, to be comfortable with the tensions, realizing that they are an inevitable feature of being in the world. Baha'u'llah says this also, and I don't think I made a slide out of this. Baha'u'llah also says this in one of the newly translated mystical tablets in that little volume, The Call of the Divine Beloved, which I highly recommend if you've read the Seven Valleys and Four Valleys and see this little book and say, well, I've already read the Seven Valleys and Four Valleys, these are just slightly updated translations. Don't miss the additional material, a few short tablets which open up whole worlds that are not there in the Seven Valleys and Four Valleys. One of which discusses this question of differences of opinion, fundamental differences, which Baha'u'llah says is going to be there, like it or not. It's a feature, not a bug. That's not a quotation. But he says, it's a feature of the human condition. And what we can do, and he says what to do about it, which is not, well, convince everyone else of your position. What to do about it is be loving, forgiving, forbearing, understanding. All of these spiritual qualities that we're trying to develop now come into play as we try to come together in unity, not despite our differences, and also in a way that sees all of these different perspectives and different ways of approach as strengths and not as weaknesses. So in all of this, so you might say this is a nice picture, and maybe you can get this useful insight about matter and spirit out of it, but where's the place of the prophet in all of this? Where's the place of the, what's the station of the manifestation in all of this? And here I want to suggest that it also nicely fits into this picture. And it fits into this picture as an answer to the question, what is it, by what mechanism does one traverse the circle? How do you ascend from the mineral kingdom to the animal kingdom? Does the mineral on its own accord ascend into the animal kingdom? Does the animal kingdom it could reach perfections of its own plane during its lifetime, but an animal cannot progress into the human kingdom on its own. Abdu'l-Baha puts it in the following way. He says, progress becomes possible only through grace. Not progress within one station, but progress along the circle of existence. Because the progress from one rank to another, and this is the circle of existence, depends entirely upon divine generosity. For example, the progress of a mineral reality to the rank of a vegetable is to be obtained only through generosity. So this word generosity, he could have used different words here. Generosity is one word. Another word he might have used is what we humans like to call revelation. He says also, true felicity for the animal consists of passing from the animal world into the human realm. Like the microscopic beings that through the air and the water enter into the body of man and are assimilated and replace that which has been consumed in his body. So in a kind of very, physical, carnivorous way, we can think of it's the eating the animal and assimilating its elements that allows it to ascend into the human kingdom. It's too bad for the animal. And Abdu'l-Baha this is not negating Abdu'l-Baha's stance on vegetarianism, I think, but it's the general picture that the kingdoms are, the ascent from one degree to the next is not really within our power. We need some help. We need to be pulled up to that next level. Abdu'l-Baha talks about this in the human kingdom in this lovely quote from Star of the West. Someone asks him, will the day come when all mankind will be able to discern by sight? Presumably this is spiritual sight. He said, there will always be some. Only a special number will have this attainment. As Christ said, many are called, but few are chosen. It will always be so. The transformation depends upon divine bounty. The mineral progresses in its own world, but from the mineral to the vegetable, it progresses only by divine bounty. Of itself, the transformation cannot take place. In the realm of men, transformation is possible only through another person. It's a kind of interesting statement. And perhaps here he was thinking about the prophet. Or perhaps he was thinking about the teacher, the role of the teacher, which is given such prominence by Baha'u'llah in his Kitab-i Aqdas. So this puts the prophets into this role. Previously we talked about the prophets as divine physicians. They diagnose an illness and they prescribe a remedy. In another way, they are educators and gardeners. They cultivate us, they lift us up out of a state of ignorance into that next state. They open up our minds and our souls and our spirits, and they raise our consciousness to the next level. And in that way, we make that ascent. Abdu'l-Baha says the teachings of Christ and the prophets are necessary for man's education and guidance. Why? Because they are the divine gardeners who till the earth of human hearts and minds. They educate man, uproot the weeds, burn the thorns, and remodel the waste places into gardens and orchards. The garden can't do that on its own. It needs the gardener. So this imagery of the gardener is kind of implies this idea about grace being necessary to make it to the higher level. And this comes from a pilgrim note, but fascinating enough, I think, to mention that Abdu'l-Baha says, was heard to have said by Dr. Falshir, that the holy divine manifestations are unique and peerless. They are the archetypes of celestial and spiritual virtues in their own age and cycle. They stand on the mount of vision, and they foreshadow the perfection of the evolving race. Almost as though they're kind of the arrowhead of the process, and they sort of pull humanity forward to the next stage of its evolution. Note that this is not answering the question, well, where do they come from? Do they just sort of appear out of nowhere and say, okay, I'm here to guide you? What's the mechanism by which a higher degree emerges on the circle of existence that acts as a catalyst for the evolution of the lower degrees? In a way, this reality of the manifestation, the reality of the prophet, is not just here for us humans. It's not just a reality active in the human world, but it's, their transformative power is found within all things. This lovely bit comes from the Gospel of Thomas, which was one of the lost Gospels of Jesus that was recovered in the sands of the Egyptian desert in the mid-20th century as part of the Nag Hammadi library. And the Gospel of Thomas was known as one of the earliest Gospels, but the full text of it was found only in recent times, and it contains, among other great material, this fascinating quotation, which is not found in the four Gospels. I am the light which is before all things. It is I who am all things. From me all things came forth, and to me all things extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me. I love that. But I wonder if the reason why that one didn't make it in, that particular quote of Jesus didn't make it into the canonical Gospels, that people just weren't ready to hear this. Sometimes certain statements are just too challenging for us to hear. Shoghi Effendi even said this in one of his letters. He says, sometimes one statement is exactly the right thing for one type of mind and the wrong thing for another. And I think that goes to this whole picture that I presented today, this picture of a circle of existence, comprising these complementary arcs, this arc of the physical world, so well described over the last few centuries, whose overarching story is entropy, disintegration, complemented by this other arc of this ascending arc of progress, of spirit, of consciousness, of love, governed in a way by its own as yet undiscovered rules, which is this arc of integration. That these two arcs, comprising and representing God's love for his own essence, to use the theological language, is a new way, a new narrative. I'll use the word narrative, although it's used a lot in modern, I guess on modern campuses as a way of perhaps diminishing the sacred stories of the past. But I would like to reclaim it and say this new sacred narrative of Baha'u'llah, of the circle of existence, can be challenging in some ways because it can undermine certain certainties. It may not be for everyone. It may not. If it doesn't help you, then set it aside and proceed as you were. But in the spirit of offering a new way of thinking, it's really only by its effectiveness and usefulness that it will ultimately be judged.